Hello, here we are again on Courage Bacchus. Welcome. Today I have a familiar face with me here. I'm interviewing Janice Lyons. Excited you can join us today. Thank you so much, Janice. I'm going to ask you a little bit about who you are, what you do for work at WIDHH.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. The last time I was here, I did speak about medical interpreting services. And if you'd like to know a little bit about me, I'm a Vancouver-born girl, proud to be from BC, from Vancouver. When I was 1, I went to the Calgary school, which was quite a distance away. And I didn't want to live in the residence, so we moved back to Vancouver again. And I have 2 older sisters, all of whom use spoken language. I was sent off to the School for the Deaf here, which I attended. And we were all required to speak. Sign language was forbidden at that time. This was around the time where the International Congress on Education of the Deaf and their resolutions in 1880 were governing how children were taught. Of course, my day-to-day language, as I spoke with my friends, was sign, but when I was in the classroom, I had to learn how to produce sounds and words, and I was trained that way for my K-12 experience. Now, when I started to work, I worked for CPR, and I was a data entry clerk. And, again, I'm working with people who don't use sign language. But when I was with deaf friends, of course, that's when I used my first language. Wasn't allowed to sign at work. I had to make do.
Wow.
And of course, that always led to misunderstandings, and I sometimes feigned that I understood, and often I'd ask people to write things out for me. So I worked at CPR for quite some time, and at coffee break, my peers were talking, and I couldn't follow what they were saying, and then they would be laughing and carrying away, and then they'd give me a snippet. Oh, they're talking about this, or they're talking about that. Do you know what I mean? Like just a snippet. So I felt like I was like a dog kind of sitting in the corner, just there and present, but not really a part of anything. And I decided, it's actually kind of funny when you think of it, right? Right? I think you've had a similar experience to me. But in any way, I went off to college eventually because I wanted to work on improving my English. And as you probably know, the schooling that we received in terms of literacy wasn't all that great, so I attended college, and to my amazement, there was an interpreter in the classroom. I wasn't expecting that. I thought, an interpreter in the classroom? That's terrific. And I found out what the teacher was saying, and I found out all kinds of things. And I'd get the words for sign language that I was, using, and I found out that, my learning of, say, academic English, simple language constructions, I'd be thinking in sort of word order form. The cat climbed over the whatever, and I'd ask, oh, how do you sign that in sign language? The cat climbed up the tree. So then I realized that the printed word and the sign language, I could understand the two. There was a match. So I decided at that time that I was going to apply for a assistant to a program at this college, and I was hired. And I was teaching students to learn sign language. And these were students who would go off to become interpreters. But also because of my experience as a kid growing up in being frustrated on the job, that funny story I said of feeling like a dog in the room. So when I would be out in public sometimes and I'd be pulled over, let's say, by the police officer, they'd start speaking to me. And I'd ask them to write into English what they were saying, because I'd show them that I couldn't speak. And they'd say, well, let's see proof of that. I said, well, I don't carry a proof of the fact that I use sign language or that I'm deaf. So there was that incident, and then there was others like it. For example, if I needed to go to see someone at ICBC as a result of a car accident, my daughter would come with me. She was quite young at that time. And I'd ask for an interpreter. But they were not familiar with the service of sign language interpreters, so they started to talk to me, and I'd ask them to write instead, or maybe to use the keyboard. But they realized that my daughter was able to hear, and so they said, oh, well, here we go. But I'm thinking, no, this isn't a solution. My daughter was thinking, well, okay, I don't mind doing this, and I had to impress upon the person at ICBC that she's just a child.
Exactly.
And she's not in a position to report on an accident. which could be, you know, potentially liable for me down the road if it was misinterpreted. So there were a number of incidents like that that were frustrating. And so I was working in the interpreting program, like I said. And years later, the Western Institute for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, or as it's also known as WIDHH, had a position opening. And it was for the department head of medical interpreting services. As you know, I was here a couple of weeks ago and I explained a bit about that. So there are two other services within that department called community interpreting services and legal interpreting services. But I want to spend a bit of time talking about the community piece, and then I'll talk briefly about the legal piece.
Sure.
So the community interpreting services piece really speaks back to the stories that I told you about ICBC using my daughter, or the police asking me to prove that I'm deaf. So the community interpreting service was there to provide access to the public. So for example, if a person who uses sign language wants to speak to a loan officer at the bank, or let's say a parent needs to attend a parent-teachers meeting, or another person wants to speak to someone at ICBC regarding a car accident, or even wants to speak to his or her employer, they can access our services, and we provide a sign language interpreter. So there are all kinds of settings where an interpreter promotes and provides equal access. And it's not just for the deaf person, it's also for the person who uses spoken language. They understand what the deaf person has to say. So it works both ways. But the most important piece, as I mentioned before, is that in my case, I use family members who act as an interpreter. And that wasn't a very bona fide way of providing service. It has to be a professional interpreter, someone who's been trained, who's gone to school. It's the same as anybody who wants to become a professional in their field. So a professional is the person who we would call upon. And they have their own professional association called AVLIC, or Association of Visual Language Interpreters in Canada. And the provincial chapter for this national organization is called WAVELY, or West Coast Association of Visual Language Interpreters. So we hired members who belong to that organization or that association, and they are professional in that they provide an equivalent message, whether it be the person who uses spoken language or the person who uses sign language. If at some point there's a complaint about the service, they have a dispute resolution program where members of the public, any member of the public, can access the program. We also receive a bit of money from the City of Vancouver. It's a grant, and this grant applies to a number of services. For example, if there's a funeral that needs to be accessed, a serious incident. Now this is a user pay service generally. So if a deaf person wants to speak to his or her lawyer, then they can apply to have an interpreter present. But unfortunately, we have realized that professionals like lawyers find it a bit difficult to be able to provide that service at their cost. So we have arrangements whereby we provide interpreting services and we have funds available. Now the other piece that I wanted to talk about was the legal interpreting services. And this is a brand new service that began 3 years ago. As I've mentioned, community interpreting services has been available for the general public, and many people that before then didn't know how to contact our services. The same was true for police, where a deaf person or that particular professional needed to learn how to access our services. So we've provided training, and we do have had a formal arrangement with the Vancouver Police Department. Now this
Amazing.
began 3 years ago, and 3 years ago we were able to work with the police department, teach them what they need to do when a deaf citizen comes through the door, give them the phone number that they could call, and an interpreter would be dispatched. There are two different phone numbers. One is for the dispatcher. Through the Community Interpreting Services Department, they would then arrange the interpreter to meet the deaf person and the police. The other phone number is for emergencies only. So that emergency number would be called, and an interpreter again would be dispatched. We started off with the Vancouver Police Department, but it's grown. The RCMP has realized that that service is now available, and so they've reached out to us, and our services have expanded. ECOM, or 911, is also aware that an interpreter is available for the deaf person or for the emergency responders. Again, the service is not only for deaf people, but it's for the person who uses spoken language.
Yes, it's important that both people have access to communication because issues can come up and you want to break down those communication barriers. That is really cool that the RCMP have started using this service now. That's great.
No, and social workers as well, and other professionals are accessing our services. And of course, it's a user-pay service when it comes to emergency personnel. Now, we already have received funds or money from Provincial Health Services Authority for medical interpreting. And so that's a different pool of money, but community interpreting services is not funded. As I mentioned before, it's a user-pay service, such as the police and other parties like that will pay for that service. So legal and community services operate in a similar way in terms of funding.
Okay, and do the police work well in the system? I know that they have their own budgets, so does that work for them? Do they accept it as a user fee service?
Well, previous to the service, which as I said, only started 3 years ago, we found it increasingly difficult around who was going to take the bill and pay the bill.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of back and forth. And eventually, as we got to the right level of, say, paying authority, we realized, and they realized, that there was money that they could support, they could use rather, to support the service. And I believe the spoken language interpreters also had access to the police funding. It's a unique language where, in some cases, some of the police personnel may have had a spoken language, a second spoken language, but it's not common to see sign language. So as we know about the ICED, or the International Congress on Education of the Deaf, we realize that spoken language is not the way deaf people communicate. We now have a formal partnership whereby if a deaf person comes in the door, deaf people have access. But as it is the case, some deaf people aren't aware, and they might decide that they can communicate in writing. But the police are now aware that they can call for that service, and an interpreter will be dispatched. Some deaf people have expressed frustration that they haven't been able to get access to an interpreter, but we've had to remind the departments that they need to provide that service and where to call. And so we give them the address, which is an internet address, widhh.ca, where on that page there are tabs that give the phone numbers to dispatch either daytime or emergency hours.
Oh, good.
So that's available to the deaf as well.
That's really important. I encourage everyone to take a look into that. If you are in a situation, you don't have to rely on writing. You can ask for an interpreter to be provided and avoid those miscommunications. You know, save some time, get the interpreter in there, and save the headache. So you are in your role at WIDHH. Can you explain what you do?
Right, I am the Department Head of Interpreting Services, and we have 3 staff in this department. Medical Interpreting Services has its own dispatcher. Community Interpreting Services and Legal Interpreting Services as well has its own booking coordinator. We have a 3rd person who is a staff interpreter for Medical Interpreting Services.
And does that team work well together?
Oh yeah, very well together, yes.
And everyone on the team signs?
Yes, they all sign, yes they do. Anyone that we hire who works for the organization must be able to communicate in sign language. Often what we have are drop-ins. We also have had the service of video relay. So there's a number of different ways. There's the TTY, the fax, and there's email, and there's the video phone. It's almost like what you would see on Skype. So we also have that. In order to communicate with someone who uses Skype, the staff person must be able to use sign language.
Okay, so it's accessible.
Yes, and CAS probably has, I would say over 50 interpreters. We call them contractors, and they are independent contractors. let's say we get a call from one of the police departments, we send out a mass mailing. Whoever is on that list of qualified legal interpreters receive a request. They respond with an email, and we confirm with an email that gives them the address.
Okay, that's helpful for you to clarify the difference between community interpreting and legal interpreting. Okay. So you had said that the interpreters are independent contractors.
Right.
What is that?
They're like freelancers. So we have 3 employees, as I mentioned, working in our department. Everyone else that we hire for community or medical, they go out to an appointment for that hour or 2 and they leave. Another job might come up, for example, in a school setting. It might be an all-day assignment. We would send interpreters for that, as well as ICBC appointments. The dispatcher would receive that call, an interpreter would be assigned, and the interpreter would be present for that appointment. Most appointments typically are on average 2 hours. So the assignment is booked for that length of time. If the assignment is going to be longer than 2 hours, then we're notified of that, which we then ask the interpreter for their availability, and then they are dispatched. If, let's say, the meeting is a half an hour in length, then we'll typically send 1 interpreter. If the meeting has many participants, then we will dispatch 2 interpreters. Because of the cognitive demands of interpreting a meeting of that size, it needs to be assigned with 2 interpreters. The same is true if it were an all-day appointment. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that we do hire deaf interpreters.
So a DI, a deaf interpreter, to be honest with you, growing up, I knew nothing about what a deaf interpreter would do. I had gone to some workshops and I saw deaf interpreters working with people who were deafblind, someone that may have Usher syndrome, and they would be interpreting there. But really, I just ignored what was happening in the presentation and watched the DI working. And in those situations, I was figuring out what they did. So I did figure out that they were working as a team. But I'm just wondering how that all started and I guess how it came about. It's really interesting.
Well, the idea of deaf interpreting isn't new. Let's say I have a very good friend who's also a deaf person, and I might be very proficient at lip reading and my friend isn't. If the person I'm communicating with who uses spoken language is lip reading or using a lot of words and no signs, then I will relay basically what I understand to my deaf friend. Now, within medical and community and legal interpreting services, we have access to what's called deaf interpreters who are dispatched to work with someone who has Usher syndrome or some sort of visual impairment, which means they might sit very close to that person as well. We will provide a deaf interpreter for someone whose first language is not American Sign Language, so let's say an immigrant. And that deaf interpreter who is fluent and is a native user of the language will know how to communicate in a way that the immigrant will understand. As well, if a person is quite ill and is using very minimal signs, a deaf interpreter will be able to catch all of that and will work with the team. So an ASL interpreter and a deaf interpreter together. Sometimes we have need for a deaf interpreter where a person who uses language that's very iconic and not particular to how we use American Sign Language, a deaf interpreter will be brought in. So we see that the demand for deaf interpreting increasing. Even our deaf seniors. Do you remember I mentioned to you last time I was here, where people kind of make like they understand, but they're not really getting it? And the reason that people do that is because they're tired of having to ask for repetition, tired of not understanding, so it's just easier to make like you get it. But when you have a deaf interpreter, It means that the language is used in a very fluent native way, and it makes the playing field much more level.
That seems like a really great option, especially in medical, legal, and community interpreting. Thanks for all the information about what you've shared. Can you kind of explain some barriers that you've experienced in those realms of work?
Well, as I mentioned before, legal interpreting services can be problematic if the police officer wants to communicate in writing. Now, I've attended where I've been asked to be there as a deaf interpreter because the person who the police officer wants to interview is a child. And because of the age difference, it's certainly not appropriate to use written language.
Of course not.
And often what happens is that deaf adults may have been willing to go along with writing notes back and forth to the police officer. But if the police officer is in a hurry, they may not make use of the service. So they need to be able to provide an interpreter to make sure that everybody is understanding each other, so that people walk away feeling that they've been heard and believing, also knowing that it's their right to have access to information. So they can feel that they are being understood and are understanding as well.
Wow. I can't imagine a situation like that. I have had my own. I had been in an accident. I was talking with ICBC and I requested an interpreter. They were refusing to provide me with one though. I had clearly asked and they said no. I had told them that English wasn't my first language and that I wanted a sign language interpreter. When they had denied my request though, I was really shocked and very frustrated. I felt like I couldn't express myself. So I told them that I was not about to go through with this when they were not going to provide an interpreter so that we could communicate clearly. And I felt like that was clear discrimination and they were not respecting my rights. And I again requested an interpreter. They stuck on their original answer and said they were not going to provide me one. So I went and talked with someone higher up in ICBC, worked with a supervisor to get an interpreter booked. And once we had that interpreter there, things went so much clearer. All my frustrations and angst about the whole situation was relieved. Without an interpreter, it would have been very different. And I was quite aggravated and frustrated that they were telling me I couldn't. It is just so important to have clear communication. And especially in a serious situation like I was in, you want clear communication.
I agree. I would say unfortunately, the literacy level of the deaf person is around grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, and often people don't write at that language level, and it can be really disastrous if they're involved in a legal matter, especially if they're talking to their physician, and it's really difficult to understand sometimes medical terminology or even what the problem is. So because of the fact that the literacy level is so low, an interpreter is the way to promote equal access, right? I
agree. Yeah, those literacy levels at that grade range are really hard. If there is some term that is not being understood, it can be really frustrating, and communication does not happen successfully that way.
And before I attended college where I had an interpreter present, I always felt that, that person who uses spoken language, they know so much more than me. Now, when I attended college and realized that I had access to an interpreter, I thought, you know what? We're all the same. Yeah, sure, we use different ways of communicating, and we all have different levels of understanding. I realized we're all the same.
Yeah. Well, we have had a really good discussion about medical, community, and legal interpreting. And just remember that if you do need an interpreter, make sure to get one in there. You have a right to an interpreter. So Janice, thank you so much for coming in today. I really appreciate it. And I have one last special thing I just want to add here. A very dear friend of mine from Ontario just passed away Monday here. It was Christina Gurdry, who was a really good friend of mine, and her favorite color was red. We grew up together. I just wanted to leave one last message that everyone consider organ donation, because it was her wish that she could have got a transplant. She was having kidney and liver issues, and she just feels so strongly about organ transplants. So I just wanted to mention that. And remember, everyone, keep a smile on your face. I just want to remember Christina, February 15th of 1985 to February 17th, 2014. Thank you so much, Christina. We all love you. And thank you, Janice, for coming in today. I've really enjoyed listening to everything you had to share with us, and interpreters are so valuable. So thank you so much for watching. Courage, Bacchus.